Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. It's Saturday, January 4th, 2025. The world never sleeps, right? Always something going on. And today, well, we've got quite a mix.
Definitely a busy news day.
Yeah, we've got a pretty devastating oil spill in the Black Sea this time. We've got a former U.S. president passing away, funeral processions, and even a story about, well, I don't want to spoil it, but it involves jawbreakers and might make you cringe a little.
What a range.
But, we don't just skim the headlines here on the deep dives.
That's right.
We like to dig deeper, get into the why. What's the context behind these stories?
The connections, the ripple effect.
Exactly. What does it all mean? And most importantly, why should you, the listener, care?
That's the key question.
So let's dive in, shall we? First up, that Black Sea oil spill. I mean, the numbers are staggering, right? 9,200 tons of oil spilled. 55 kilometers of coastline affected.
It's the largest spill in the region this century.
Wow. Okay. So a storm's being blamed as the initial cause. But of course, as with most things, there's more to the story, right?
There's always more to the story. And in this case, it's important to look at the impact of Western sanctions on Russia. These sanctions have forced Russia to rely more on older oil tankers. Sometimes they're referred to as a shadow fleet to transport their oil and, well, essentially evade those sanctions.
The shadow fleet. I see. So these older tankers, maybe not as well maintained, maybe more prone to accidents, especially in rough weather. Is that what we're saying?
Exactly. And that leads to a question, right? Did these sanctions, while aimed at crippling Russia's economy, did they inadvertently contribute to this environmental disaster?
That's a tough question to answer. And it's interesting, Russia's blaming the storm completely, while Ukraine's suggesting that, well, the sanctions played a part. It's almost like a real-world example of how these global events, they have these complex ripple effects, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And the ripple effects of this oil spill, they could be devastating. We're talking about potential long-term damage to marine life, to the entire Black Sea ecosystem, really. It's a potential environmental catastrophe.
It's hard to even fathom, right? And the cleanup effort. 86,000 metric tons of sand already removed.
Imagine that.
And Putin himself called it an ecological disaster.
A powerful statement coming from him.
It really is.
Yeah.
All right, well, shifting gears a bit now, today also marks a more somber occasion here in the U.S. It's the funeral procession for former President Jimmy Carter, who passed away earlier this week.
Yeah, the images coming out of Plains, Georgia were really quite poignant. The farm bell tolling 39 times, crowds gathering to pay their respects. Really a moving tribute to a life dedicated to service,
It really seems like it. And, President Carter's legacy, it goes way beyond just his time in the White House, doesn't it? I mean, he was this tireless humanitarian, a champion for peace. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work. So from your perspective, what would you say was his most impactful contribution to world peace?
It's tough to isolate just one, but his role in Camp David Accords, brokering that peace between Israel and Egypt, it was undeniably significant. It was like a pivotal moment in Middle Eastern diplomacy, and really a testament to his commitment to dialogue, to peacemaking.
Absolutely. And President Biden has declared a national day of mourning in President Carter's honor, so.
A fitting tribute.
Yeah, his impact will definitely be felt for generations to come. I think it's safe to say.
I think so. His life really underscores the idea that public service can be a powerful force for good in the world. It can be.
All right. Well, now let's turn to a story that unfortunately highlights a much darker side of humanity. Two young girls from El Salvador, they were abandoned at the U.S.-Mexico border by smugglers.
Heartbreaking. Really a reminder of the dangerous journeys that so many migrants, especially children, are forced to undertake, The desperation and the lack of safe and legal pathways for them to seek refuge.
Yeah, when you hear stories like that, it really makes you question the systems we have in place, and how can we create a more humane approach to border security, to immigration policy? These are tough questions.
Absolutely. It raises those difficult questions about the balance between security and compassion, And how do we address those root causes that drive people to risk their lives in this way? I mean, what do you think needs to change to prevent these tragedies?
I don't know if there's an easy answer. We need to create those pathways for safe and legal migration, right? But we also have to address the economic and social factors that are forcing people to flee their home countries in the first place.
Right. It's multifaceted. It's complex.
It's so complex. And on that rather somber note, it's almost too fitting that today also saw two separate fire tragedies, one in China and one right here in Dallas.
Yeah. Let's start with the fire in China. It ripped through a vegetable market in Zhangjiakou City. Sadly, it claimed 8 lives, left 15 people injured. They're still investigating the cause, but it's just a reminder of how quickly things can turn tragic, you know?
Mm-hmm.
A normal day.
Just like that.
Mm-hmm.
And here in Dallas, a fire at Plaza Latina. It's a market known for selling animals. And the result, well, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
They lost 579 animals in that fire.
Awful. You know, these fires, geographically diverse as they are, they both underscore the importance of fire safety regulations, especially in these crowded public spaces.
It's a good point, and it's also a reminder of the cascading impact of these kind of events, right? Think about the vendors who've lost their livelihoods, the families who've lost pets. It goes way beyond the immediate tragedy, the immediate loss.
Absolutely. The ripple effects. Far-reaching and often overlooked, I think.
Okay. So let's take a quick pause here, run through some other headlines that caught our attention today, starting with some travel disruptions. Pulkovo Airport in St. Petersburg, they had to temporarily suspend all flights due to safety concerns.
Yeah, details are still coming out, but it's definitely causing some major headaches for travelers in the region. Hopefully they can get things sorted out quickly.
I hope so. And in a bit of political news, the newly sworn-in Senator J.D. Vance is, well, he's recovering from minor sinus surgery. Shouldn't affect his duties in the Senate, but, you know, it's a reminder that even politicians, they're not immune to those pesky health issues, right?
A humanizing moment. Behind those political personas are real people, after all.
That's true. And for our seafood-loving listeners out there, just a heads up, the FDA issued a warning about oysters from Oregon and Washington. There's a chance they could be contaminated with norovirus, so maybe stick to the cooked seafood for a while, just to be safe.
Better safe than sorry, especially when it comes to foodborne illnesses.
No kidding. Okay. So, we've covered a lot of heavy stuff today. But before we go any further, there's actually some good news, believe it or not. On the crime front, murder rates across the U.S., they've dropped significantly, almost 16% compared to last year.
That's significant. And it's not just murder rates. We're also seeing decreases in other types of crime, like car theft, which is down about 20%.
Wow, that's really encouraging, isn't it? I mean, what do you think is contributing to this decline? Is there one main factor?
You know, it's likely a combination of things. It could be increased community policing efforts. It could be social programs aimed at addressing poverty and inequality and possibly even stricter law enforcement. It's hard to say for sure.
So many factors.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that these complex issues, they rarely have simple solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it takes that multifaceted approach to really see some lasting change.
Agreed. And it's not just about punishment, but about prevention, right? And addressing those underlying social and economic factors that contribute to crime in the first place.
That's a great point. All right. So before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, we can't forget our bizarre news of the day segment. We always like to end on a lighter note. And today's story, well, it's a jaw-dropper. Literally.
Oh, I can't wait to hear this.
Okay, so are you ready for this? A Canadian student trying to conquer, you guess it, a jawbreaker, ended up splitting her jaw in two.
Ouch. That sounds painful.
I know, right? Makes you appreciate those softer candies a bit more. But seriously, folks, be careful with those jawbreakers out there.
A word of caution. Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about jawbreakers and crime statistics. Quite a range, I know, but now let's shift our focus a bit to some international stories, things that you might not have heard about today, but they could have, well, some pretty significant global implications.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in those big headline-grabbing stories, right? But sometimes it's those quieter stories, the ones that kind of fly under the radar a bit, that really end up shaping the future. So where are we headed first on this international journey?
Well, our first stop takes us to the UK. They've just opened their first ever safe drug consumption room. It's in Glasgow, Scotland. And it's a pretty controversial move, but it reflects a growing global trend towards what's called harm reduction when it comes to drug addiction.
Harm reduction, okay.
Yeah.
So for those who might not be familiar with that term, what does that mean in this context?
Well, it's a public health approach that acknowledges that people are going to use drugs, regardless of whether it's legal or not. So instead of focusing solely on punishment, harm reduction aims to minimize the negative consequences that are associated with drug use.
So these safe consumption sites, they essentially provide a supervised environment, right, for people to use drugs, with medical professionals on hand in case of an overdose or other emergencies.
Exactly. The idea is to reduce the risk of overdose and
Huh.
spread of diseases like HIV and hepatitis C and all those other harms that can come from using drugs in unsafe, unsanitary conditions.
It's a pretty radical departure, wouldn't you say, from that just say no approach
Yeah.
that we've seen for so long, right?
Mhm.
But isn't there a risk that these safe consumption sites, they could be seen as kind of condoning or even encouraging drug use?
It's a valid concern, definitely one that's been raised by critics of this harm reduction model. But supporters argue that it's a pragmatic approach. It prioritizes saving lives, reducing harm. They point to evidence that these sites can actually help people access treatment and support services that they might not otherwise seek out.
It's a really complex issue, isn't it, with strong opinions on both sides, for sure. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the UK and whether it influences drug policy in other countries. I mean, what do you think the long-term implications could be?
It's hard to say for sure, but this could be a real watershed moment
Yeah.
in the way we approach drug addiction globally. If it's successful, it could pave the way for similar initiatives in other countries that are grappling with the opioid crisis and other drug-related challenges.
Right. So from a controversial public health policy to a potential political shift, our next stop takes us to Myanmar. They just announced the release of 6,000 prisoners
Mm.
as part of their Independence Day celebrations.
This is significant, especially when you consider the country's recent history. I mean, Myanmar's been under military rule since that coup back in 2021, and there's been a lot of international pressure to release political prisoners and restore democracy.
So could this prisoner release be a sign that the military junta is starting to loosen its grip on power a little bit?
It's possible. It could be a gesture of goodwill, a way to appease those international critics, or even a genuine step towards some kind of reconciliation. But we need to be cautious here. It's still too early to tell what the motivations behind this release are and what it really means for the future of Myanmar.
Definitely a situation that warrants close attention. We'll have to keep an eye on who exactly is being released and what conditions they'll face upon their return. Speaking of returns, our last story today takes us to, well, the world of longevity. We have to acknowledge the passing of Tomiko Atuka, the world's oldest person. She died in Japan at the age of 116.
It's incredible. Her life, it spanned a period of immense change, upheaval from world wars to technological revolutions. I mean, it's almost impossible to grasp the scope of history that she witnessed in her lifetime.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What would it be like to live for over a century, to see the world transform so dramatically? What do you think her story tells us about the human experience?
I think it speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, our capacity to adapt, to endure through extraordinary circumstances. It's also a reminder of the preciousness of life, the fragility of life, even one that spans 116 years.
It's a poignant thought to end this segment on, for sure.
Yeah.
From the challenges of drug addiction and political turmoil to the quiet passing of a remarkable individual. It's been a day filled with diverse and impactful stories. But we're not done yet. After a quick break, we'll be back to wrap things up with some final thoughts and questions that we hope will stay with you long after this deep dive is over.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From that devastating oil spill to that jaw-dropping jawbreaker incident. But before we sign off, I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on some of the bigger questions these stories raise, the things that maybe make us think a little bit. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the daily news cycle, that churn, but it's important to step back sometimes and consider the long-term implications of these events, Where are we headed?
Exactly. So, for example, we talked about that decline in murder rates in the U.S.
Right.
But what does that really tell us?
Yeah.
Is it a sign of genuine progress, or is it just a temporary blip? What role do things like social programs, economic conditions, policing strategies, what role did they play in these trends? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's certainly a positive development. There's no doubt about that. And it's likely due to a combination of factors, increased community policing efforts that might be helping to build trust, reduce tensions between law enforcement and the communities they serve. We've also seen some promising initiatives aimed at addressing poverty and inequality, which are often, as we know, root causes of crime.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it does make you wonder, is it sustainable? What steps can we take as a society to ensure that this trend continues, that we don't just slip back into old patterns.
Right. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it's going to require a sustained commitment
Hmm.
to addressing those systemic issues that contribute to crime. Investing in education, job training, affordable housing, mental health services, these are all crucial pieces of the puzzle.
It's a reminder that real change, it takes time, right? It takes effort.
Yeah.
And a willingness to invest in those long-term solutions. It
Yeah.
can't just be a knee-jerk reaction to crime statistics.
Yeah.
Speaking of long-term impacts, I wanted to circle back to that oil spill in the Black Sea. It's a stark reminder, isn't it, of the environmental damage that can result from accidents, but also just our reliance on fossil fuels in general.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on that? What can we do as individuals, as a global community, to prevent these kinds of disasters from happening in the future?
Well, this is where individual actions and global cooperation, they really intersect. We need to transition away from those fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy sources. But it comes down to those everyday choices, doesn't it? How we consume, how we travel, the products we support. All of these decisions, they contribute to the bigger picture.
So it's not just about governments and corporations. It's about each of us taking responsibility for our own environmental footprint.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in protecting this planet that we share. And thinking back to that story about the safe drug consumption room in Scotland, it it raises a crucial question, doesn't it? How do we as a society, how do we balance that individual freedom with the responsibility to protect public health and well-being? It's a delicate balance, and one that's constantly being debated, I think.
It's a reminder that there are no easy answers, no one-size-fits-all solutions to these complex challenges. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from today's deep dive. The world is messy, it's complicated, it's full of contradictions. But by staying informed, by engaging in these thoughtful discussions, and by being willing to challenge our own assumptions, well, we can start to navigate these complexities and work towards a better future, can't we?
I couldn't have said it better myself. So to our listeners, we encourage you to stay curious, to keep asking those questions, and remember, every day brings new opportunities to learn, to grow, and to make a difference.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the news. We'll be back next week with more insights and analysis. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.